So let's check out how the woodwinds interact with the other sections of the orchestra. Like we talked about before, this piece is made up of strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. So at various points in this composition, the woodwinds are enforced or helped by other sections. And conversely, other sections are helped and reinforced by the woodwinds. Probably the first example in this piece comes right here, where we have the second violins reinforcing what's going on in the woodwinds. So let's hear what that sounds like all together. Now without that, we have this, and I will mute the percussion for now. And then bring it back. So it's very subtle, but it does help to reinforce things. We also have a similar thing going on here with the cellos, reinforcing these lower instruments here, the clarinet and the bassoon. It's very subtle, it's very light. Now, one of the things that I tried to do every time I used the strings to reinforce what was going on with the woodwinds specifically is really try and adjust the string dynamic to match, because this particular strings library that I'm using is a very large string library. I believe it was recorded with over 80 players. So each one of the sections is quite large. So we're matching up 8 or 10 cellists with a single clarinet player and a single bassoon player. So we have to do some dynamic management there, which is why if we look here at what's going on for this portion, we can see that we have the dynamics, which are controlled by the mod wheel, are pretty low. I mean, they're barely above the middle line here. So they barely get up to a mezzo piano, maybe. Where the clarinet and the bassoon are getting more into their upper dynamic ranges here. We start at, about a mezzo forte, and we get up here into the loudest dynamic area, not quite the loudest. But we really have to do some dynamic management in there. Now, I also, to give this particular section just a little bit more punch, I also added and I'll mute the rest of the percussion here because those cymbals can sometimes get a little obnoxious. I also added a xylophone here. And again, so as we go along, a lot of times we are using one string section or another string section to reinforce what's going on in the woodwinds. Now for this whole section, we have a glockenspiel reinforcing what's going on with the rest of the instruments. It's just a single Glock note. As the melody starts to build, we go into glockenspiel with octaves. And also we have strings up here as well. Very subtly. I tried to make the woodwinds the forefront, so you have to do a lot of dynamic management like we talked about before. And also on these runs here, you can definitely hear the woodwinds, especially that piccolo, but a lot of times I try and augment that or reinforce that with the strings. So if we take out that, it doesn't sound bad. But when we add that little bit in, it really helps give it a little bit more power, a little bit more depth. Now in this part, we have the brass kind of jumping in here. So here's what's happening in the brass and the woodwinds. Mostly what you're hearing there is brass, but you can tell the difference with or without the woodwinds, even in that loud kind of brass section there. In this next minor section, the woodwinds pretty much carry the melody, except for this middle part here where they're reinforced with a little bit of violins. Doing a little harmony. And this last part in the strings is all just harmonic and rhythmic support. Pizzicato stuff going on here in the violas. Cellos and basses doing a bass line there, and the second violin's doing a syncopated little rhythmic texture in there. And as we jump over here to the next section, you can hear in this section, I think I had originally come up with this next portion with some longer chords in the strings, but that didn't really keep the pulse of the piece going. So I decided to use this staccato idea here and then do the scale idea here with the second violin. To really contrast these longer notes here. Then we bring everybody in. When we looked at the woodwinds here, the flutes and the piccolos doing this trill, I also did a trill with the strings as well. So check this out. That creates a very interesting texture with a lot of tension. Just the woodwinds is nice, just the strings is nice, but together and then in this next soaring melody here, you have a lot of reinforcement here from the strings. Along with most of the woodwinds. I mean, without the woodwinds in here, it definitely has a different color quality. In this next section here, most of the woodwinds are taking a needed break. And we have theme going on here with the horns. And then we have a muted trumpet bring back the A section as a hint of what's to come. We have a couple of runs, and they are augmented with the strings. The first one is not, but the second one is really helped with these strings. Woodwinds. And then we add this one string part. It really gives it a nice zing. The same thing with this second. Really gives it a good bit more power and helps it sit in the mix a little bit better. And without the woodwind runs in there, you really lose. The violins just don't speak out. But they're almost just lost in the background. But with the woodwinds in there, definitely makes a huge difference. As we move to the end of this piece, we start with the flute 8VA, which is flutes and piccolo, with the melody. And then we add the trumpets. Along with the horns. This is one of those parts where you can really hear the piccolo and the flute sitting on top of everything, even at the loudest dynamics there as we get to the end of this phrase. you can still hear those flutes in there. And that's a lot of the tricky parts of putting a larger orchestration like this together. And this is certainly not large in the scope of orchestration. So in the strings, I wanted to create this really fast string thing in here to really just jack up the intensity. And then this little piccolo solo, check it out without the glockenspiel. It just adds a nice little bright percussive-y punch with that in there. So that's my composition, 7 Cs. I was really pleased with the way this came out, and I really had a lot of fun putting this together with the woodwinds. It's a lot more of a delicate balance of dynamics management when you're working with the other instruments. You know, brass pretty much cuts through anything. Strings are the bed and the foundation for everything. Percussion, because it's loud and very transient, that cuts through everything, and it's a very delicate thing to be able to work in these very beautiful colors of the woodwinds into this chaos of the rest of the orchestra. It takes a lot of care and a good bit of planning to be able to carve holes and make some space for the woodwinds to sit, if the idea is that you need to hear them above everything else. I mean, there's certainly a lot of ways that you can use woodwinds which are not in front of the orchestra. I hope that this piece illustrates some of that for you. I tried to use a lot of articulations in here, trills, portatos, staccatos, staccatissimos, legatos, and combining articulations to really give you an idea of the type of things that are possible with a really fantastic library like Berlin Woodwinds. So I hope you found that useful, and I hope you enjoyed this composition that I put together.